don't know who to trust, you are divided.
It's late February 2003. A high-level meeting is underway in Moscow, and everyone's eyes are locked onto two of the most powerful men in Russia. One is Russia's president, Vladimir Putin. The other is the country's richest man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, CEO of the oil giant Yukos. And right now, he's sitting among Russia's elite oligarchs, directly in front of President Putin. Khodorkovsky has been asked to say a few words about corruption, something that's plagued Russia for decades. Usually, people in this position play it safe. They blame a few corrupt customs officials, maybe point fingers at a greedy mayor somewhere far from Moscow. Keep things vague. Keep things safe. But Khodorkovsky doesn't do that. Instead, he does something that will cost him everything. Live on television, he openly accused the president of Russia of allowing corruption at the highest levels of the state. He pointed to a recent oil deal where the state-owned company Rosneft allegedly bought a small private firm for several times its true value, simply to funnel public money into the pockets of powerful Kremlin insiders. Putin was furious. He immediately reminded Khodorkovsky about Yukos' own past, a tax fraud case that was quietly resolved with a bribe. And in that moment, the arrow of accusation turned back to Khodorkovsky himself. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned a Russian proverb. A word is like a sparrow. Once it flies out, you can't catch it. Putin used that moment brilliantly. A former KGB spy, calculating, patient, and brutally strategic.
А вы умеете прощать?
Да. Но не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
In front of the most powerful man in Russia, the richest man in the country had just signed his own downfall. And Putin never misses an opportunity. What followed next unfolded like a slow burn nightmare. Within months, pressure on Yukos began to rise. Companies connected to Yukos were suddenly targeted. Investigators raided offices, searched apartments, and one by one, Khodorkovsky's closest allies were arrested. Naturally, his friends and advisors begged him to flee the country, but he refused. Because at that time, Yukos was on the verge of a massive deal. American oil giant ExxonMobil was in talks to buy a major stake. If that deal succeeded, the United States would gain influence inside one of Russia's biggest oil producers. For Putin, that was unacceptable. A geopolitical nightmare. It's around 5 a.m. on a cold October morning in 2003. Khodorkovsky's private jet lands in Novosibirsk, about 16 kilometers from Moscow, to refuel during one of his many business trips. Suddenly, the control tower announces a routine inspection. The pilots are ordered to move the plane to a remote stand. 3 men in airport security uniforms board the aircraft. They check the cockpit, walk through the front, then prepare to leave. But then, heavy footsteps echo outside. Masked men, armed with automatic weapons, stand directly in front of the cabin door. Khodorkovsky knows exactly who they are. Spetsnaz, the most elite and dangerous special forces unit of the FSB. And they're here for him. That same day, he is flown to Moscow and taken before a judge. The charges begin to pour in. Massive fraud, forgery, embezzlement, tax evasion, contempt of court. He can only smile in disbelief. The charges begin to pour in. Massive fraud, forgery, embezzlement, tax evasion, contempt of court. 8 months later, the trial begins. Khodorkovsky and his business partner sit inside a steel cage in the middle of the courtroom. It becomes clear immediately, this trial would never be fair. The judge blocks key witnesses. The prosecution presents flawed and withheld evidence. A year later, both men are found guilty and sentenced to 9 years in prison. At the same time, his company Yukos is hit with massive tax claims. The state seizes control of their assets. Their most important oil fields are sold off to Rosneft. Khodorkovsky is sent to a remote penal colony in northern Russia. Strict surveillance, very limited contact with the outside world. Then, in 2007, just as he's nearing parole, new charges are filed. 2 years later, he's sentenced to a further 14 years in prison. Russia's richest man had now lost a $15 billion fortune, his company, his empire, and his freedom in less than 2 years. And with more charges coming, release seemed almost impossible. But then, in 2013, rumors suddenly start to spread. Putin has new plans for Khodorkovsky. At a year-end press conference, Putin announced that Khodorkovsky would be released. Russia was preparing to host the Winter Olympics, and the country faced global criticism over its human rights record. According to Kremlin insiders, freeing a few political prisoners was the easiest way to ease international pressure. One of them was Mikhail Khodorkovsky. A few days before Christmas, he was released. After more than 10 years in some of Russia's harshest labor camps, he walked free. Khodorkovsky was one of the first oligarchs to challenge Putin publicly. But it's also fair to say he benefited from exploiting the same corrupt system he later criticized. But one question remains. Was Khodorkovsky the first person Putin had done this to before? The answer is yes. The first victim was Vladimir Gusinsky. Gusinsky was the owner of NTV. His channel criticized Putin. They raised questions about the Chechnya war. In 2000, right after Putin came to power, masked armed men raided Gusinsky's office. He was arrested. He was charged with embezzling $1 billion. In jail, he was kept in a cell with HIV-infected prisoners. A few days later, he sold his media empire and fled the country. The second victim was Boris Berezovsky. Berezovsky was one of the most powerful at that time, even though he had helped bring Putin to power. So Khodorkovsky was the third big victim, but he was the only one who stayed in the country. He didn't flee, and that's why he had to spend 10 years in prison. But how did Mikhail Khodorkovsky become so rich? Born in Moscow in 1963, this man was the son of an ordinary family. His parents were factory engineers. In his youth, he was a strong communist supporter. In 1986, he graduated with a degree in chemical engineering, but instead of joining a government job, he chose a different path. At that time, the Soviet Union was in crisis. For the first time, private business was being permitted. Khodorkovsky took advantage of this opportunity. First, he opened a cafe. Then, he started importing computers. He made good profits by supplying computers to Soviet ministries. In 1989, he founded Menatep Bank. It was one of Russia's first private banks after the Soviet collapse. In 1995, at an auction, Khodorkovsky bought Yukos for only $309 million. At that time, the company's actual value was about $5 billion. The interesting thing is, that auction was conducted by Khodorkovsky's own bank, Menatep, meaning he himself was the buyer and he himself was the auction supervisor. But at that time, Yukos was on the verge of bankruptcy, $3 billion in debt, producing only 500,000 barrels of oil per day. His current net worth is estimated to be less than $1 billion. He currently lives in London as an exile. He funds independent media, helps exiled opposition leaders, and assists many Russians escaping political persecution. He hopes that one day, when Russia becomes safe and free, he will return to his homeland. He hopes that one day, when Russia becomes safe and free, he will return to his homeland.